Once upon a time, many, many years ago, a rich merchant in Baghdad sent his servant to the marketplace to buy provisions. And after a while, the servant came back white-faced and trembling and said, "Master, when I was in the marketplace, I was jostled by a woman in the crowd, and I turned to look, and I saw that it was death that had jostled me. And she looked at me and made a threatening gesture. Oh, master, please lend me your horse that I may ride away from this city and escape my fate. I will ride to Samara, and death will not find me there." So the merchant loaned him the horse, and the servant mounted it and dug his spurs into its flank, and as fast as the horse could gallop, he rode towards Samara. Then the merchant went to the marketplace, and he saw Death standing in the crowd, and he said to her, "Why did you make a threatening gesture to my servant when you saw him this morning?" And Death said, "I made no threatening gesture. That was only a start of surprise. I was astonished to see him here in Baghdad, for I have an appointment with him tonight in Samara."
Welcome to episode 8 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where we put two films together to create something far greater than the sum of its parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week I'm unpacking two rather unusual takes on vampire mythology. First up is Isle of the Dead from 1945, produced by Val Lewton, who we discussed back in episode 2, and starring the legendary Boris Karloff. This is a slow-burn, character-driven piece set during the Balkan Wars of 1912 and concerns the Greek myth of the Vorvolika, a creature that exists to, quote, "drain all of the life and joy from those who want to live," end quote. The film has also been named by Martin Scorsese as one of the 11 scariest horror films of all time. Then we jump forward 32 years to 1977, and Martin from director George A. Romero. This movie marks the first time that Romero would work with special effects wizard Tom Savini, and is a character study of a young man who believes himself to be a vampire. Or then again, maybe he doesn't. And it was one of the director's favourites of all of his films. Just as a heads up, this is also likely to be one of my longest episodes to date, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. Before we proceed, however, it's time to acknowledge the key sources that I've used in creating this episode, which, as always, will be linked or listed in the show notes. For the segment on Boris Karloff and Isle of the Dead, I have referred extensively to the official Boris Karloff website, karloff.com. And I've also largely referenced the book Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror, by Joel E. Siegel. I've also used the books Universal Horror by Tom Weaver, Michael Brunus, and John Brunus, Dreams of Darkness by the author J. Peter Lott, Icons of Grief, Val Lewton's Homefront Pictures by Alexander Nemiroff, and American Gothic, 6 Decades of Classic Horror Cinema by Jonathan Rigby. And for the section discussing the film Martin, I have heavily referred to the book George A. Romero Interviews, edited by Tony Williams, which, as the name suggests, is a collection of interviews that appeared in various publications between the years 1973 and 2010. I've also referenced the book George A Romero on Screen by Chris Wade, the documentary film The American Nightmare, which was released in the year 2000, and various special features and commentaries on the Blu-ray release of the film from Second Sight Films and the Immortal Edition DVD release, which was released by Arrow Video. The film Isle of the Dead has come in for a fair amount of criticism since its release for being somewhat of an unbalanced film, with an exposition-heavy opening giving way to a far more spirited final third. This is quite possibly a valid point. However, whilst this is certainly not the strongest of Lewton's RKO pictures, I still believe that there is much here to admire, not least in its themes of corruption and decay, as well as some of the central performances, particularly Boris Karloff, who, as regular listeners will know, is one of my horror heroes. Isle of the Dead would be the first of a trio of films that Lewton would make with the actor, which include The Body Snatcher, also in 1945, and Bedlam in 1946. However, a lengthy break in production on Isle of the Dead would mean that although it was chronologically the first of the films that Boris Karloff started to shoot, it was actually the second of the three films that would be released. These films came at a rather low point in Karloff's very lengthy career, and the actor referred to Lewton as, quote, the man who rescued me from the living dead and restored, so to speak, my soul, end quote. And whilst Karloff might be best remembered for his most famous work at Universal Studios, for me it is these three films that really showcase his talents as an actor. I am, of course, going to use this opportunity to talk rather extensively about Boris Karloff, but given that his career spanned 5 decades and encompassed 174 films, as well as numerous TV, theatre and radio performances, this will be less of a deep dive and more of a discussion on what I personally consider to be his career highlights. Boris Karloff was born William Henry Pratt on November the 23rd, 1887 in Camberwell, London, and was the youngest of 9 children in an Anglo-Indian family. As a child, he had to overcome several physical challenges. He was bow-legged, he stuttered, and he also had a lisp. And whilst he managed to overcome the stutter, the slight lisp would stay with him for life, becoming something of a vocal trademark. In 1909, aged 21, he left the UK for Canada and initially worked as a labourer to make ends meet. He started his acting career working in small touring theatre companies and adopted the stage name of Boris Karloff. His family had not been supportive of his theatrical aspirations and had wanted him to join the civil service. So the name change was partly to avoid embarrassing the family name and also, no doubt, to add a level of exoticism. These were very difficult years for him, where he earned very little pay, but he did gradually develop his skills as an actor, although he later recalled that his early performances were marked by mumbling, missed cues, and bumping into furniture. Between acting gigs and to supplement his income, he continued labouring, and this led to a back injury that would trouble him for life. And it's worth remembering that when we talk about the filming conditions for Frankenstein in a few moments. In 1917, he travelled to Hollywood, where the silent movie industry was still very much in its infancy. Looking to find work, he took any role available, initially as an extra. Because of his Anglo-Indian heritage and dark complexion, he was often cast in roles that required a quote-unquote exotic-looking foreigner, something that would continue as the industry progressed from silent to talking pictures. Although he gained slightly more substantial roles, work was still very much a struggle, and he often had to supplement this by additional work as a truck driver or working in construction. In later interviews, he described this period as over 2 decades without any financial security, and friends recalled him living very much hand-to-mouth, and even contemplating leaving the acting profession altogether. But, in a lesson to us all, his dedication never wavered, later saying that his only ambition was to be a professional actor. And whilst times were undoubtedly incredibly hard for him, as he battled with obscurity, poverty, and also no small amount of doubt, it was that unwavering commitment which set the stage for the life-changing opportunity that came in late 1931. By 1931, he had finally started to secure some larger roles, most notably in Howard Hawks' prison drama The Criminal Code, where he played an incredibly menacing character, a performance that would help him finally secure his big break. And you can find that film on YouTube, by the way, if you're interested in checking it out. One day at the studio, he was on a lunch break, and he was approached by an assistant to the director James Whale, who was then casting the movie Frankenstein. According to some, James Whale had been very impressed by Karloff's performance in The Criminal Code, and wanted him to test for the role of the monster. Later, looking back on this moment, Karloff recalled, quote, "He said it was for a damned awful monster. I felt rather hurt, because I had on a very good straight makeup and my best suit, and he wanted me to test for a monster." End quote. Nevertheless, he eagerly accepted the opportunity, and the rest, as they say, is cinematic history. Frankenstein, as we all know, was a smash hit, both critically and commercially. Heavily inspired by German Expressionism, the film is a masterpiece, and Universal's publicity department certainly built up the mystery around the actor behind the monster. Karloff's identity was kept firmly under wraps, and even in the opening credits, his name is replaced with a question mark. But by the time audiences reached the end of the film, he was, quite rightly, all that they could think about. Personally, I find it hard to think of any other film actor who has played the role with such a combination of pathos and menace, and his first appearance, heralded by heavy footsteps as he approaches from down the hallway, is truly something to behold. But it was far from being an easy shoot. The costume weighed approximately 48 pounds, including 4-inch platform boots that weighed 11 pounds each, none of which would have helped his lifelong back injury. As well as the costume, there was also the makeup, created by Universal's Jack Pierce, which took 4 hours each day to apply. Filmed on a very tight budget and schedule, the production was characterized by intense and extended shooting days. And in hindsight, it's no wonder that just 2 years later, in 1933, Karloff helped found the Screen Actors Guild to advocate for better working conditions. He immediately followed Frankenstein with another horror classic, The Mummy, in 1932, in which he starred as the ancient Egyptian priest Imhotep, a role which made the most of the actor's angular features. In the same year, he also appeared in a particular favourite of mine, The Old Dark House, which reunited him with Frankenstein director James Whale. In this film, he plays Morgan, a mute and menacing manservant, and in the opening credits, he was billed simply as Karloff, a sign of his headliner status. It's a very strange comedy horror about a group of people trapped by a landslide in the Welsh mountains, requiring them to take shelter in the house of the title, where they meet the truly insane Femme family. Featuring highly memorable performances from Eva Moore and Ernest Thesiger, it also stars Charles Lawton, Melvyn Douglas, Raymond Massey, and Gloria Stewart, who modern audiences may best remember for her role as the elderly Rose in the 1997 movie Titanic. The Old Dark House is really one of my comfort movies, particularly if I'm feeling under the weather, and again it is, at the time of recording at least, available to watch on YouTube. The same year, he also had a supporting role in the gangster masterpiece Scarface from Howard Hawks, in which he played the mobster Tom Gaffney, This was one of his rare non-horror parts, and a film which has been called out as one of the most influential gangster movies of all time. Between 1933 and 1935, he truly cemented his status as a horror icon. In 1933, he returned to Britain for the first time in years to star in his first British movie, The Ghoul, playing a deranged Egyptologist obsessed with rejuvenation and resurrection. It isn't the best of his films of the period, but it did allow him to reunite with his family. And whilst Karloff was reportedly anxious about how they would respond to his fame, his brothers were incredibly supportive and even posed for publicity photos. Back in Hollywood in 1934, he headlined in the movie The Black Cat, marking the first time he would work with actor Bela Lugosi, with whom he would go on to film a further 7 movies. Directed by Edgar G. Ulmer, this is another favourite of mine, in which Karloff plays a satanic architect, locked in a deadly game of wits against Lugosi's character, Dr. Verdegast. And that's a name that would be referenced over 40 years later by Dario Argento in his movie Suspiria. Despite being released just before the notorious Hays Code introduced heavier censorship in Hollywood, the film still caused great concern at Universal, and with its themes of Satanism, necrophilia, incest and torture, it's not difficult to see why, really. Despite being a huge hit for the studio, it was in fact banned in several countries, including Austria, Finland and Italy. It's an incredibly stylish but very dark film, with Karloff's character Polzig residing in a Bauhaus-inspired mansion. It also features a minor performance from one of my favourite Universal contract players. Yes, I even have those. And this is a guy called Harry Cording. He would go on to play a number of memorable villains in the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies nearly a decade later. The Black Cat is, of course, supposedly based on the story by Edgar Allan Poe, but in reality this is in title only, much like The Raven, which would be released the following year, and which would reunite him once again with Lugosi. However, it was in 1935 that he would reunite with James Whale once again, and reprise his most famous role in the movie Bride of Frankenstein. This is widely considered to be one of the greatest horror movies of all time, and is in many ways superior to its already impressive predecessor, giving the lie to the notion that sequels are always a bad idea. Featuring another memorable performance by Ernest Thesiger, the film gives the creature the ability to speak, eliciting even greater sympathy from the viewer, and co-stars Elsa Lanchester in the double role of both the bride and Frankenstein author Mary Shelley. Bride was a critical success and cemented Karloff's legacy as the tragic monster, but he would only play the role for Universal one more time, in their follow-up, Son of Frankenstein, co-starring Basil Rathbone, and which was released in 1939. Though he later said that he considered the monster to be the best friend he ever had, Karloff was wary of typecasting and wished to step away from the role, and for the rest of the franchise, the monster would be played, with admittedly diminishing returns, by Lon Chaney Jr., Bela Lugosi, and Glenn Strange. The timing of Karloff's decision was also very opportune. At Universal, the horror bubble was beginning to burst, with the films becoming repetitive and reduced to lower-budget B-pictures as the horror movie boom of the 1930s started to fade. At this stage, Karloff went to work for Columbia Studios and Monogram Pictures, starring in a series of low-budget but entertaining mad scientist movies, often playing kindly doctors driven to madness by science gone wrong. These films include The Man They Could Not Hang in 1939, Before I Hang in 1940, The Man with 9 Lives, also in 1940, and The Devil Commands in 1941. 1941 would also mark one of Karloff's most surprising triumphs, which would come not on screen, but on stage. In this year, he took to Broadway and appeared in the play Arsenic and Old Lace, playing the sinister Jonathan Brewster, a murderous thug who's constantly said to look like Boris Karloff, which of course he did. Audiences loved it, and it allowed him to show a gift for comedic timing. The play was a runaway hit and actually ran for years, and it's a shame that he could not reprise the role in the movie version. However, the filming clashed with his Broadway performances, and so the role in the movie was given to Raymond Massey, his co-star from The Old Dark House. The 1940s marked a period of transition for Karloff, and not just because of his stage success. This was also due to the declining studio interest in horror movies. Although he kept busy, appearing on stage and radio, quality film roles were in short supply, and Karloff found himself recalling that the quality of work was a real struggle to find. The big-budget, prestigious horror productions of the early 1930s were now a thing of the past, and had largely given way to B-movies. One only has to look at films such as Ghost of Frankenstein from 1942 to see the stark contrast in quality and production values. But things would happily change for him in 1945 when he signed a 3-picture deal with RKO Studios, home to producer Val Lewton's horror unit. Lewton was initially not at all happy with the arrangement, with Karloff's previous roles a very far cry from the naturalistic and suggestion-based horror that Lewton was interested in making. However, they would go on to form a very positive working relationship, and the 3 films they made together, Isle of the Dead, The Body Snatcher, and Bedlam, would allow Karloff to showcase his talents as an actor. The Body Snatcher, loosely based on a story by Robert Louis Stevenson, would also mark the last time that he would work with Bela Lugosi, and it also starred the British actor Henry Daniell, a man who would, in the same year, provide what is, to my mind anyway, the greatest incarnation of Professor Moriarty, when he starred opposite Basil Rathbone in the 1945 Sherlock Holmes movie The Woman in Green for Universal Studios. You can see what I mean by tracking that film down, also on YouTube, but please, 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 watch the original black and white version and not the colorized monstrosity. Following his RKO movies, Karloff found himself more often in supporting roles. In 1947, he appeared in the movie The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, a comedy starring Danny Kaye, which was remade in title only in 2013 as a vehicle for Ben Stiller. By the 1950s, Karloff's film roles had shifted firmly into the world of the low-budget thriller. He became somewhat of a staple in the mad scientist subgenre, appearing in films like The Strange Door in 1951 and Corridors of Blood in 1958. During this period, though, he also found a home on US television, hosting the anthology series Thriller from 1960 to 1962. This show, in no way related to the Brian Clemens series we discussed a few weeks ago, is a more supernaturally charged version of The Twilight Zone and features some standout episodes. My favourites include The Hungry Glass, based on a story by Robert Bloch and featuring a very young William Shatner. There's also the story A Wig for Miss DeVore, starring Patricia Barry, and the quite brilliantly titled Pigeons from Hell. This is a gruesome piece of Southern Gothic, which has often been called one of the finest examples of serious television horror ever aired, or at the time, at least. As with many of the films I've recommended in this episode, it's also currently available on YouTube, and comes highly recommended, with even Stephen King calling it the best horror series ever put on television. A few years later, Karloff found a new lease of life, working with Roger Corman and American International Pictures. He co-starred in The Raven in 1963, which was screenwritten by Richard Matheson, and was a comic fantasy very loosely inspired by Poe. In this, he also starred opposite horror legends Vincent Price and Peter Lorre, and he followed this up with another Corman production, The Comedy of Terrors, again a black comedy in which Karloff, Price, Lorre and Basil Rathbone gleefully sent up their on-screen personas. During this period, Corman and Karloff also made a film called The Terror, which also starred a very young Jack Nicholson, and which is a testament to Corman's rather opportunistic approach to filmmaking. Using the sets and some of the cast from The Raven, including Nicholson, the film was supposed to be shot in 2 days. However, Corman later went on to say that it turned into the longest production of his career, calling it an ordeal that required 5 directors and 9 months to complete. One of these directors was a young Francis Ford Coppola, who, as we all know, would go on to direct The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, and who cut his teeth working for Corman, as did many other cinematic legends. These included Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro. Despite its cinematic pedigree, The Terror is, if I'm honest, really not a very good film, but it did form the basis for a far better movie, also starring Karloff, that we'll discuss in a few moments. Perhaps one of Karloff's finest roles in his later career came in 1963, when he worked with the great Italian horror director Mario Bava on a film called The Three Faces of Fear, also known as Black Sabbath. And yes, this is indeed the movie from which the Ozzy Osbourne band took its name. This is an anthology movie in which Karloff acted as both host and star. There are, as the title suggests, 3 stories in the film, including the quite terrifying A Drop of Water. Karloff stars in the segment The Verdelak, playing a vampire father returning to terrorize his own family. Although not a box office success on its initial release, it has gone on to be recognised as one of Bava's greatest works, though I would recommend watching the Italian version, which, despite the rather unsettling dubbing of Karloff into Italian, is far superior to the American release, which was extensively cut and also reordered. Following this, Karloff's movies can, at best, be described as rather patchy. In 1965, he appeared in Die Monster Die, a British-US co-production that is a very loose adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's story The Colour Out of Space. Another film, supposedly inspired by Lovecraft, was Curse of the Crimson Altar in 1968, from director Vernon Sewell, in which he co-starred with Christopher Lee and fellow horror icon Barbara Steele. Christopher Lee has described this film as terrible, and despite the promise of its casting, I think it can, at best, be described as disappointing, and that's if we are being very, very generous. Between these 2 films, though, came another unexpected triumph, as in 1966, Boris Karloff lent his voice to a different kind of monster altogether. This was the animated version of How the Grinch Stole Christmas, directed by Chuck Jones, the man behind cartoon classics such as Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck and The Roadrunner. This TV special, which Karloff also narrated, first aired on December the 18th, 1966, but has gone on to be a perennial holiday favourite. The audio recording also earned Karloff a Grammy and introduced his voice to a whole new generation, securing him a place not just as a horror icon, but also as part of the American Christmas tradition. His last truly great film came in 1968, with the release of Targets, produced once again by Roger Corman, and which marked the debut of director Peter Bogdanovich. This film recycled scenes from the movie The Terror, and cast Karloff in the role of an aging horror star, Byron Orlock. In the film, Karloff's old world movies are placed in sharp contrast with the real-world modern horrors of a spree killer played by Tom O'Kelly, and it's loosely based on the actions of a real-life mass shooter called Charles Whitman. Released shortly after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the film was a commercial failure, though it was a success with the critics, with the New York Times calling it an original and brilliant melodrama. More recently, a Time Out magazine retrospective called the film, quote, a fascinatingly complex commentary on American mythology, exploring the relationship between the inner world of the imagination and the outer world of violence and paranoia, both of which were relevant to contemporary American trauma. End quote. Sadly, though, this would not be Karloff's final screen appearance. The same year, despite failing health, he agreed to shoot a series of low-budget Mexican horror films, including The Fear Chamber, The Incredible Invasion, House of Evil, and Isle of the Snake People. Released after his death, his scenes were filmed very quickly in Los Angeles, and then intercut with other scenes that were filmed overseas. I have only seen Isle of the Snake People, and quite honestly, I thought it was an absolute mess. Reviews of the remainder certainly don't encourage me to track any of them down. But if there's anyone out there who feels I am missing out, please let me know. Though, frankly, I would be very surprised if there is. Boris Karloff died of pneumonia, aged 81, on February 2nd, 1969, in Sussex, England. He left behind 174 films, and a legacy that few could rival. As the film historian Carlos Clarence once put it, he, quote, gave dignity to horror and a human face to the monstrous, end quote. From silent movies to Frankenstein's monster, and from Italian Gothic to children's Christmas classic, the man is a legend in cinema. And if you're not familiar with any of his work beyond the Frankenstein monster, I'm hoping that this episode has given you some suggestions for further exploration. And after that very lengthy segue, can't say I didn't warn you, we now travel back to 1945 and our first film for the week, Isle of the Dead. This was directed by Mark Robson, produced by Val Lewton, and stars, of course, Boris Karloff, alongside Ellen Drew, Mark Kramer, and Jason Robards Sr. And now we are about to get into spoilers, so if you haven't seen Isle of the Dead yet, please approach with caution, or better yet, track it down and then come back. As I mentioned earlier, the casting of Boris Karloff at the studio insistence was not something that Lewton was initially on board with. Director Mark Robson recalled that Lewton was called into the office of RKO executive Jack Gross, a man whose idea of horror was, quote, a werewolf chasing a girl up a tree, end quote. This, of course, is about as far removed from Lewton's vision as one could possibly get. The executives were quick to inform Lewton that they had just signed Karloff to a 3-picture contract and that he was going to use him in his next film. A furious Lewton, returning to his office, picked up the phone immediately and informed both executives that he had a message for them, and that message was that, quote, death is good, end quote. Whether this was a threat or an indication of the themes they would explore in the movie remains rather unclear, and the ambiguity was probably the point. But despite Lewton's initial apprehension, a film had to be made, and Lewton began working on the screenplay, collaborating with screenwriters Ardell Ray, Joseph Michel, and director Mark Robson. Robson, who had worked as the editor on Cat People in 1942, had been promoted to director for Lewton's movie The Seventh Victim in 1943. Robson would go on to have a very successful career. Some of the stars and films that he directed would include Lana Turner in the Oscar-nominated Peyton Place in 1957, Frank Sinatra in the 1965 war movie Von Ryan's Express, and the tragically short-lived Sharon Tate in the not very good, but strangely compelling Valley of the Dolls in 1967. The inspiration for the film comes not, as with The Leopard Man, from a novel, but instead a painting, entitled Isle of the Dead, by the Swiss artist Arnold Böcklin. This is the painting that we see under the opening credits, and it was one that was very popular in Central Europe across the 20th century. As with many works of art, there are actually several versions of Isle of the Dead in existence, which were created by the artist between the years 1880 and 1886. All of these depict a desolate rocky island viewed from across an expanse of dark water. In most of them, we see a small rowing boat arriving at a jetty, with an oarsman manoeuvring the boat from the stern, whilst in the bow of the boat, facing the island, is a standing figure clad entirely in white. The island is dominated by a dense grove of tall cypress trees, which have long been associated with cemeteries and mourning. The painting is, as its name suggests, incredibly sombre, but interestingly, the name was actually not specified by the artist. It was instead provided by an art dealer, although it does derive from a letter that was sent by Böcklin to its original commissioner. The painting has actually inspired a surprising number of people, including Salvador Dali in 1932 and the Swiss artist H.R. Giger, who created a biomechanical version of the picture in 1977. It's also been suggested that the design of Skull Island in the 1933 movie King Kong was influenced by the painting. A copy also appears in Terry Gilliam's movie 12 Monkeys, and it's also referenced in the 2017 movie Alien Covenant, though this may be more to do with the Giger version than the original. For Lewton, the choice of painting seems to have been a natural one. A print of it hung in his home as a child, and he often made up stories about it. Robson recalled that the writing process was enormously enjoyable, saying that one night they sat up to 4 a.m, creating what he called a perpetual motion horror sequence. This was achieved by situating the heroine's house so that every time she had to go anywhere, she had to pass through a long dark tunnel, which absolutely terrified her. No matter where she wanted to go in the story, she had to use the tunnel, and each time she was scared to death. With this idea, Robson said, no matter what direction the plot took, they were guaranteed a steady stream of terror. Now, if you've seen the movie, you may find this anecdote rather curious, as the sequence doesn't appear in the finished film, with the long dark tunnel shown only briefly, though admittedly to very good effect. Sadly, the hand of the studio was involved here again, though more on that a little bit later. Principal photography on Isle of the Dead began on July the 13th, 1944, but the production very quickly ran into trouble. Just 2 weeks into filming, Boris Karloff's chronic back injury, made even worse by years of strenuous stage work and physical roles, flared up badly enough to require surgery, and this meant that the shoot would be put on hold for several months. Rather than let the downtime go to waste, Lewton moved ahead with his movie The Body Snatcher, another Karloff vehicle, shooting it while Isle of the Dead was on pause. Filming on Isle didn't resume until early December 1944, and by that point the actress Rose Hobart, who had been originally cast as Thea, had committed to other work. Lewton recast the role with the actress Ellen Drew, and completed the film with her in the part. The title of both the painting and the film is incredibly appropriate in its ambiguity. The Isle of the Dead in the film is an island cemetery, but it can also be taken to refer to the various characters we meet who are staying there, most of whom are doomed from the very moment that they set foot on the shore. This theme is underlined by the film's central and recurrent image, a statue of Cerberus that stands by the dock, a figure that we continually cut back to, admittedly somewhat clumsily at points, throughout the film and also at the climax. Cerberus is the three-headed dog from Greek mythology, whose primary role is to prevent the dead from escaping the realm of Hades, and also to prevent the living from entering without permission. In this respect, the figure is the stone embodiment of Karloff's General Farides, who is, in fact, nicknamed the Watchdog, and who prevents anyone from leaving the island. But Cerberus is also, very importantly for this film, a symbol of transition and a reminder of the inevitability of death. This theme, that death will come to us all and that attempts to evade it are futile, is one that Lewton would explore in several of his movies, including the arguably more successful Cat People and the doom-laden The Seventh Victim. The knowledge of this symbolism also gives an extra resonance to the very last shot of the film, where Cerberus is superimposed on our departing survivors, and this suggests that while they may have escaped the horrors of the island, death will eventually come for them in the end. After the opening credits, the film begins with a text-based prologue. Quote, "Under conquest and oppression, the people of Greece allowed their legends to degenerate into superstition, the goddess Aphrodite giving way to the Vorvolica. This nightmare figure was very much alive in the minds of the peasants when Greece fought the victorious war of 1912. End quote. This opening text sets not only the time and place, but also one of the themes of the movie, that under extreme circumstances, man will lose his grip on reason and rationality, descending into superstition and corruption. The beauty of the goddess Aphrodite, once the goddess of love, has become the nightmarish Vorvolica, a creature that, as the movie tells us, exists to drain happiness and life from anyone who wishes to hold on to it. To emphasize this theme of corruption, we learn very early on that the peasants who once lived on the island have already been corrupted before the film has even started, ransacking the cemetery and robbing the graves in an effort to find antiquities. This is all due to the presence of the archaeologist Albrecht, who explains, somewhat shamefacedly, quote, "I had turned good simple people into grave robbers." End quote. The notion of corruption, though, ironically enough, also extends to the screenplay itself. The final film is reportedly a very different product to the original intention. In the book Val Lewton, The Reality of Terror, author Joel E. Siegel describes that a pivotal character of the original shooting script, named Kathy, never appears, or is in fact even mentioned, in the final film. Several other major characters are also eliminated or unrecognisably altered. In addition, he tells us, half a dozen themes and subplots were hacked away or jettisoned altogether, and he suggests that the shooting script was abandoned at the last minute, and that a new one was, in his words, quote, slapped together, which attempted to replace Lewton's melancholy poetry with conventional notings of plotting and action. End quote. Lewton himself was very unhappy with the changes, all of which seem to have been at the behest of the studio, writing in a letter to his mother during production that he thought the film was a complete mess. At the time, he thought it would be his last horror picture, which it wasn't, and he was very sorry that he couldn't end the genre with a final success. Once filming was completed, he went even further, saying that the film looked hopeless, and that the only thing that would make it interesting would be to go absolutely madly radical in the editing process. His final verdict, delivered once post-production was completed, is perhaps even more damning, but it also gives us a very strong indication of the original concept. In another letter, he said, quote, "It started out as a rather poetic and quite beautiful story of how people, fleeing from the battles of the Greek War of 1912, are caught on this island by plague, and through their sufferings come to an acceptance of death as being good, the fitting end. It ended up as a hodgepodge of horror. This has been a horrible and unfortunate film from the beginning, largely due to my stupid supervisor, but it's turned out that it won't be too bad." End quote. This intriguing extract offers us a glimpse of what might have been, but I personally feel that it does the film rather an injustice, though one can, of course, understand Lewton's frustration. His letters also offer an explanation for the film's rather uneven tone and structure, which appears jagged and uncertain, particularly when compared to the slow inevitability of his earlier work. In this context, it is no small miracle, and a testimony to the talents of both Lewton and Robson, that the film still manages to have a depth to it that even studio interference was unable to tarnish. As well as the themes of death and corruption, Isle of the Dead is also, much like Night of the Eagle a few weeks ago, about the conflict between rationality and mythology, and logic and superstition. Nowhere is this more clearly demonstrated than in the dialogue between the character of Dr. Dros and the archaeologist Albrecht, who suggests that lighting a fire and praying to the god Hermes would be just as effective as the doctor's instructions for the residents to avoid physical contact and to keep washing their hands. And for a modern audience, these precautions have an unexpected resonance, with the continual hand-washing and social distancing a poignant reminder of what the world experienced during the first half of this decade. For today's viewer, the arguments between science and superstition cannot help but raise an ironic smile, or at the very least, an ironic eyebrow. Most notably where General Farides is admonished for immediately breaking the no-contact rule just seconds after Dr. Dros has issued it. Dialogue between the character of Farides and Thea, played by Ellen Drew, also very sadly takes on a new meaning when viewed through the lens of 2025. When she criticises him for his savagery in his previous role as a tax collector and reminds him that he had massacred his fellow countrymen, his justification is that, quote, "Whoever is against the law of Greece is not a Greek." End quote. Thea, however, has the final word on the subject, saying that laws can be cruel, and that people who live only by the law are both wrong and cruel. Farides, however, is a man who lives only by the law, even when that law extends to people he considers his friends. When first introduced, he is washing his hands, silently passing sentence on one of those very friends, as he is stripped of his military uniform and sent back to the battlefield to end his own life. This image is, of course, a reference to Pontius Pilate washing his hands at the sentencing of Jesus. But whilst Pilate was reputedly shamed by his own actions, hence the hand-washing, Farides is unapologetic, saying that his way is the only way that he knows. This is immediately challenged by the character of Oliver David, a journalist and our nominal hero, who questions not only his actions, but the very belief system that underpins them, saying, quote, "I think I understand patriotism as well as the next man, General, but I'm not sure I understand your brand. I think you'd kill your wife and child for your country's sake." End quote. Karloff's performance is, along with his co-stars Catherine Emery and Helena Thimig, one of the strongest in the film. At first stern and dogmatic, but still somehow sympathetic, he slowly descends into fanaticism and cruelty, partly due to his role as the watchdog, and also due to his slow infection with the septicemic plague, which we have been told causes delirium and hallucination. His transformation is both psychological and physical, deteriorating from the smart and uniformed military officer we meet at the beginning to a dishevelled dictator of chaos as his hallucinations and long-suppressed superstitions begin to take hold. Even a man of logic and order, the film suggests, can succumb to the old beliefs if the conditions are right. This is of course exploited by the character of Madame Kira, who is played quite brilliantly by Helena Thimig. Thimmig, an Austrian actress, was one of Central Europe's leading performers for over 50 years and lived in exile in the States during World War II, returning to Austria in 1943 only after she was widowed. Her character here is both superstitious and extremely dangerous, creating a conspiracy against Thea, persecuting her with such ferocity that Thea herself begins to wonder if the speculation might indeed be true. Both her and General Faridi's constant use of the term Vorvolika, issued firstly as a warning and then as an accusation, foreshadow a similar use of the term Nosferatu that we will see in our next film, Martin, suggesting that both Thea and Martin are less monsters and more products of societal persecution. One also wonders, at least initially, how much of this Madame Kira actually believes, and how much of it is a distraction from her own participation in the grave robbing mentioned earlier. She is the last of the peasants remaining on the island, and her excuse for the burning of the disinterred corpses is that the bodies had to be destroyed, as there was an evil one among them. This is possibly a justification or an excuse for her actions, using superstition to mask the crimes of the guilty. Whether or not this is the case, we never find out, though by the end of the film, when she finally gets her long-deserved comeuppance, there is no doubt that she believes her own stories. Her terror as she lies in bed, listening to the approach of the now completely insane Mrs. St. Aubyn, is brilliantly portrayed, and, for the audience, it must be said, immensely satisfying. This, of course, happens in the final third of the movie, which, after an exposition-heavy opening, suddenly bursts into terrifying life. Reviewers of the time were quick to pick up on this, with one stating that, quote, "When the shriek of the prematurely buried woman finally comes, it releases the rest of the movie into a free-for-all masterpiece of increasing terror, which would have pleased and scared the daylights out of Poe himself." For all of the film's gentle dawdling, horror specialist Val Lewton and his colleagues have turned Isle of the Dead into one of the best horror movies ever made. End quote. This is possibly taking things a little bit far, but the final third of the movie is indeed very well handled, springing into life with the premature internment of Mrs. St. Aubyn, leading to a set piece of Thea making her way through the aforementioned darkened tunnel, and giving rise to a genuine jump scare as Mrs. St. Aubyn suddenly appears from the darkness. Sadly, this moment is nowhere near the sustained tension of similar sequences in The Leopard Man or Cat People, and is intercut with yet more exposition as Oliver and Albrecht are explaining what has happened for the benefit of the audience. Of course, this film is directed by Mark Robson and not Jacques Tourneur, but given that Robson managed to sustain tension quite brilliantly in The Seventh Victim, one suspects the hand of the studio at work yet again. Given the nature of studio interference in the film and the subsequent post-production salvage job that Lewton described in his letters, it is perhaps unsurprising that the film opened to very mixed reviews. We have already heard some of the more positive ones, but others were far more disparaging, and the New York Times dismissed the film as, quote-unquote, superstitious claptrap. Wish they wouldn't sit on the fence like that. I really do. Isle of the Dead was not a runaway success when it first opened. For a Val Lewton production, it came with a relatively hefty price tag. Reports place the final cost around $246,000, but it only just managed to make back that investment. Reliable international box office figures are hard to come by, although it appears that the film performed rather modestly across most territories. Today, despite its flaws and very troubled production history, Isle of the Dead is recognised as an atmospheric and psychologically layered piece of work. Variety magazine has noted that it was better handled and directed than most horror films of the time, and Time Out magazine, here in the UK, singled out its evocative imagery, calling the burial sequence, ironically enough, magnificently alive, and praising the eerie appearance of Mrs. St. Aubyn in her white flowing robes. As I mentioned at the very top of the show, Martin Scorsese has named the movie among one of his favourites and has called it one of the scariest films ever made. And for Boris Karloff's daughter Sarah, Isle of the Dead is one of her father's masterpieces, sparked alive, in her words, by his gentle soul. Personally, the film remains a flawed but fascinating piece of work, and as I've mentioned, modern viewers will find a lot more subtext in the movie than was intended at the time it was created. The use of lighting and shadow, whilst perhaps not as effective as in movies such as I Walked with a Zombie or The Leopard Man, is still very striking, most notably the silhouettes on the tent that introduce Karloff, the shadows of the blinds as Thea tends to Mrs. St. Aubyn, and the final sequences where Madame Kira gets her comeuppance. The tracking shot of Farides and Oliver walking across the battlefield strewn with corpses is also incredibly well done, and was allegedly inspired by the paintings of the Spanish artist Francisco Goya. Karloff's performance, as I have mentioned, is a very complex one, depicting the slow unravelling of a man of honour, and he is more than matched by both Helena Thimmig and Catherine Emery, who plays Mrs. St. Aubyn. And special mention must go to Emery, whose Mrs. St. Aubyn is a kind, noble, but ultimately tragic figure. Her fear of catalepsy is introduced early, and leads to a moment of unbearable horror as we see, through a very small movement of her lips, that she is indeed about to be buried alive. It's also worth noticing that when she is indeed interred in the crypt, it is within a makeshift coffin marked Antiquities, an ironic circular reference to the fact that the island graves were once desecrated in the search for treasure. As for the legend of the Vorvolica, the corrupted figure of the goddess Aphrodite, in this film it is no more than a superstition, one that is brought to life through the fanaticism of Madame Kira and the mental deterioration of General Farides. And this is a concept that we will see very much in action once again as we move into our second film in this week's double bill. Martin was released in 1977 and was written and directed by George A. Romero. It stars John Amplas, Lincoln Meisel, Christine Forrest and Tom Savini. And we are getting into spoilers very early with this one, so as always my standard warning applies to anyone yet to see the movie. It's available on multiple streaming platforms and also available on YouTube, and if you haven't seen it, you really are missing out. Word of warning though, if you are going to watch it, make sure you watch to the very, very, very end of the credits. George A. Romero really needs no introduction, and given how long this episode is shaping up to be, that's probably just as well. We'll be covering another of his films later in the series, where I will go into far more depth on his biography and his career. So for now, let's just say this. His impact on the horror genre is impossible to overstate. Over a career that spanned more than 4 decades, he directed 24 feature films and worked on a number of television productions, most notably creating the cult anthology series Tales from the Dark Side. He was not just a director, he was also a prolific screenwriter, a producer, and an occasional actor. While he's most famously remembered as the creator of Night of the Living Dead, and widely credited as the godfather of the modern zombie movie, his work extended far beyond that subgenre. His filmography includes supernatural horror, psychological thriller, action drama, and even, in one instance, a romantic comedy. Martin, which is a smaller and more intimate film than the ones for which he is probably best remembered, is essentially a character study, and of all of his movies, Romero claimed that it, alongside Night Riders from 1981, was his favourite. This, like many of Romero's earlier films, is set in and around Pittsburgh. Though he had been born in the Bronx in New York City, he moved to Pennsylvania to study at what was the then Carnegie Institute of Technology, which is now better known as Carnegie Mellon University. And this, incidentally, was also the educational home of US pop artist Andy Warhol. On completing his studies, he chose to remain, living and working in the city into the 2000s. At the time of filming, in 1976, the city was going through a rather painful transition. For the first half of the 20th century, Pittsburgh had been the beating heart of America's steel industry, but by the 1970s, things had started to change. Foreign competition from countries like Japan and West Germany was undercutting the US market, and decades of underinvestment meant that the city's steel industry just couldn't keep up. It was outdated, it was inefficient, and it was perceived as too expensive to run. The result of this quote-unquote progress was, of course, mass unemployment. Whole communities, who had relied on mill work for generations, suddenly found themselves cut adrift. Small businesses closed, property values collapsed, and public services were overstretched and underfunded. And for Romero, the setting of the movie was more than just convenient. It represented the collapse of the past. In a 1977 interview, he explained that the setting signified that, for a traditional vampire, the old days were gone, industrial pride was gone, jobs were gone, and the church was collapsing. For Romero, everyone was just surviving, and once proud communities were gone with the wind. The character of Martin, regardless of his disposition for drinking blood, is of course not a traditional vampire. He is a lonely, confused, repressed and deeply disturbed young man who relies not on fangs, but on modern devices such as hypodermic needles, sedatives and razor blades to get his fix. His family, not knowing exactly what to do with him, pass him from relative to relative, subjecting him each time to religious methodologies to cure him of his affliction. In this context, the movie could be as much a parable about addiction as it is about vampirism. But for Romero, the message is more complex. For him, the point of the film was to show that the tradition of supernatural monsters was in reality just a reflection of human nature, and that we created these monsters in an attempt to exorcise the beasts that exist within us. And with this film, what he was trying to say is that evil is a permanent part of humanity, and that it can't be so easily removed or thrown away. Martin is played by the actor John Amplas, who Romero had seen performing in a play at the Pittsburgh Playhouse, and immediately thought, this is the guy. His performance in the film is really quite remarkable, particularly given that it was his first feature, and he brings a complexity and humanity to the character that almost elicits audience sympathy. And this is no small feat, really, considering that we know from the outset he is a murderer. This is, of course, essential to the film's success, as we are with the character for the entire runtime of the movie, and in the hands of a lesser performer, Martin may not have drawn such a complex series of emotions from the viewer. Nowhere is this more clearly felt than the sequence where Martin's planned attack on a potential victim is thwarted by her unexpectedly being with her secret lover. We naturally do not want Martin to kill them, but we also want him to get away before the police can be called, and this conflict of emotions on the part of the viewer adds greatly to the tension, and the scene is a highlight of the movie. And also, to be honest, the fact that the woman is far more concerned with being discovered by her husband than helping her now quite seriously injured lover suggests that she's not particularly a good person. Not that she deserves to die, of course. Amplas approached the role of Martin with a deep affinity for tragic, psychological and complex characters, those who act not out of cruelty, but out of necessity or inner compulsion. He has expressed a preference for horror characters who are blamed for things beyond their control, or who commit troubling acts as a means of survival or self-protection, rather out of a cold desire to cause harm. These are the roles, he has said, that allow for a subtler, more emotionally grounded kind of psychological horror, He was also particularly struck by the character's profound isolation, his sense of disconnection from others, and the all-consuming nature of his obsession, something, again, akin to an addiction that Martin himself couldn't even fully understand. Romero himself has expanded on this idea, explaining that Martin's delusions are most likely the product of a fanatical upbringing, and that the repeated accusations of Nosferatu, endured across a lifetime, have fed directly into his fantasy life. We've already seen in Isle of the Dead that Madame Kira's constant accusations of Vorvolica were enough to make Thea question her own reality, and that only took place over the matter of a few days of isolation. Romero suggests that Martin has endured this torture for a lifetime. His cousin Kuda's house is littered with religious iconography, and quite frankly, it's a display that even Margaret White would envy. But whilst her daughter Carrie turns this oppression against her mother and the bullies in her hometown, Martin's neurosis goes far deeper and turns him into a cold-blooded killer. Romero would go on to say, quote, "I don't believe he's 84 years old. I think those are things that have been drummed into him from infancy from people like Kuda. So he's a victim, and when he tries to explain his problems, the people around don't listen or don't take him seriously. His neighbour, Mrs. Santini, just wants to get laid, so she uses Martin. Martin is very honest and open about his problems when he calls the radio talk show, but the talk show host just says, 'Great, keep calling.'" End quote. Martin, then, is as much a victim as he is a monster, and his black and white fantasies of an older and simpler time are probably as much a form of escapism from the everyday horrors of reality as they are symptoms of his delusion. He may outwardly deny being a vampire, munching on garlic cloves and grabbing at crucifixes, but inwardly he still fantasizes that he is one. His assertion that there is no such thing as magic, illustrated by the trick he demonstrates at the kitchen table, is probably a reflection of the reality that he must wake up to every morning. Kuda's granddaughter, Christina, is the only character to offer any true warmth or interest in Martin as a person, and she is played by the actress Christine Forrest, who would go on to become Romero's wife. And her performance is, like most of the performances in the film, naturalistic and incredibly believable. One worries for her safety, but we also understand that she is possibly the only person who can save our protagonist from himself. Any opportunity for this salvation, though, is thwarted by her relationship with Arthur, played quite brilliantly by special effects maestro Tom Savini. Tom Savini had met Romero many years before when he had been in high school, and he had originally been earmarked to work on the movie Night of the Living Dead. However, a tour of duty in Vietnam meant that he had been unable to do so. Now back in the US and in college, he heard that Romero was about to embark on a vampire movie, and initially wanted to audition for the central role. However, with Amplas already cast, he was instead given the role of Arthur, and also put in charge of special makeup effects, and doubled as a stuntman. This film would mark the first time that Romero and Savini would work together, and they formed an incredibly productive relationship that would continue for decades. It is a common misconception that Savini became interested in special effects makeup during his tours in Vietnam. However, this is really not true. He had long experimented with the craft from a very early age. He does, however, recount in an interview given for the documentary The American Nightmare that by the time he was serving in basic training, his scarring was so impressive that his drill sergeant asked Savini to send home for additional makeup so that he could intimidate the next batch of recruits with some suitably terrifying war wounds. What Savini does say about Vietnam is that his role as an army photographer allowed him to, firstly, create some essential emotional distance from the atrocities of war that he saw on a daily basis, but also allowed him to objectively study the reality of horror. This may sound somewhat clinical, but it was as much a survival technique as it was anything else, providing a tool with which he could remove himself mentally from the terror that he felt every day. And this perspective would, of course, inform his later special effects makeup work. In retrospect, Savini is somewhat critical of his work in the movie, particularly the blood effects, which he says look like melted crayons. And this was a result of using theatrical stage blood that was designed to look effective under the bright lights in a theatre, as opposed to the cinema screen. Filming for Martin began on August the 8th, 1976, and concluded in October of the same year. Romero and his production team have described the experience as guerrilla filmmaking, and it is indeed proof of what can be achieved on a low budget with a limited crew, which amounted to about 15 people, including the cast. Filming locations were in real homes around Braddock, Pennsylvania, and Cuda's house, where Martin stays, was in fact the home of a Pittsburgh filmmaker called Tony Buber, which he shared with his parents and grandmother. Buber is primarily known for his documentaries, which focus on working class communities and social issues in and around Braddock and nearby Pittsburgh. He also appears in the film, as does his mother, who is one of the customers in Cuda's grocery store near the beginning of the movie. Her recollections of the filming process are incredibly positive. She not only gave the filmmakers access to her house, but also ensured that they were incredibly well fed between takes, cooking for the cast and crew, and ensuring that, as Romero put it, they, quote, ate better here than on any set I have ever worked on, end quote. She also had to wash the sheets and the bathroom after the climactic staking sequence, recalling that the sink was full of blood, and that she had to convince her own mother, who was quietly praying in the corner with her rosary beads, that the blood was not real, and that actor John Amplas was both alive and well. In true guerrilla filmmaking style, the filmmakers also took full advantage of real-life events. The parade sequence in the movie was, indeed, a real parade, prompting the crew to pick up cameras and include it in the film. Romero was originally the director, camera operator, and director of photography, but after a few days shooting, decided to pass the DP role onto Michael Gornick. Gornick used what is known as reversal film stock, which, unlike negative film, eliminates the need for a separate printing process to create the final product for projection. This is, of course, a more cost-effective and time-effective solution, but also creates a very different aesthetic, with a tendency towards higher contrast and saturation. They then washed this film down to create the final version, because they wanted the print to look seedier, and this is why the film has more grain to it than perhaps other films of the period. Interestingly, Romero's original intention was to release the film in black and white, and in a much, much longer form. The original version of the film, he has said, ran to nearly 3 hours, but commercial considerations held sway, and the film was drastically cut, and the black and white footage was maintained only for the fantasy sequences. So the film that we are now familiar with really took its final shape in the editing room, and listening to the various director commentaries that are available on Blu-ray and DVD releases, one starts to get a sense of what we might be missing. Over the last few years, it has emerged that an original version of the film has been discovered, and I understand that plans are afoot to release this version in the originally conceived black and white format. On its release in 1977, Martin suffered from very poor distribution, or more accurately, and according to Romero, it didn't have any real distribution at all. As a result, it made very little impact, and reviews were not particularly favourable, a recurrent theme in this series, it would seem. The Washington Post, writing about the film in 1978, called it pretentious, and compared it to, quote, pornography that is dressed up for people who don't want to admit their taste, end quote. Clearly, that is the work of somebody who really understands the horror genre, and, very politely, fuck you too. And again, This is true of most of the movies in this series. The film has gained a cult following through TV screenings, which is how I first encountered it in the very early 1980s, and of course through home video, DVD, and Blu-ray. Modern retrospectives have largely embraced the film as an underrated classic, highlighting its human drama and its psychological complexity. But perhaps I will leave the final word on the movie to George A. Romero himself. Quote, "It's my favourite, though it never had any sort of distribution at all. But what with home video, now I go to these conventions and I sign more Martin DVDs than anything else. It's amazing so many people have rediscovered or discovered it for the first time. I just wish they would have showed up when it first played." End quote. While both of this week's movies are stylistically very different, with Martin offering more realistic visuals and performances compared with the black and white moodiness of Isle of the Dead, they are of course both psychological takes on the vampire myth. Martin is the victim of religious fanaticism, with his cousin Cuda pronouncing him to be one of the undead and clinging onto the superstitions of the old country to ward off evil. Despite Martin's assertions that there is no such thing as magic, the fears of his relatives, doubtless inflicted on him since childhood, have been turned inwards, fueling his fantasies and a desire for blood. In Isle of the Dead, fear is similarly victimised, first by Madame Kira, endlessly whispering outside her door, and then by General Farides, turned against her first by the influence of Kira, and then by the symptoms of the septicemic plague. This persecution is enough to make her question her own reality, and wonder whether she does indeed leave her body at night to prey on Mrs. St. Aubyn. In both movies, then, it is the religious establishment and figures of authority that are to blame for the real issues, projecting their own neurosis onto others, and creating nightmare scenarios as a result. Both of these stories are also set in worlds that are crumbling to make way for the new, and they both suggest that it is an attempt to hold on to the past with its outdated belief systems and superstitions that ultimately create the nightmare. Perhaps then, what both movies ultimately offer us, aside from the thrills of their content, is a warning that in the void between the old and the new, unstable, unguarded, and uncertain, we must all be very careful, lest we inadvertently create our own monsters. And that brings me to the end of what is, I suspect, going to be a very long episode. So if you are still with me, thank you so much for listening. If you would like to support the show, please consider taking a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And also, please consider sharing it with any of your horror-loving friends. It helps much more than you can imagine, and in trying to beat the algorithms, I need all the help I can get. Next week, I will be back with an anxiety-inducing double bill where we explore the horrors of friendship and urban paranoia. Our movies next week are two that, remarkably for me, aren't from the 1960s or the 1970s. In fact, they are both from 2015, though, admittedly, that is a decade ago. First up, we have They Look Like People, an indie horror from director Perry Blackshear, which gave me so much anxiety when I first saw it that I had to stop watching. Admittedly, though, that was only for a few moments. Then we move on to The Invitation from director Karin Kusama, which, again, is possibly not for anyone who struggles with sustained unease and dread. If you're in the UK, They Look Like People is available from Prime, Apple TV, and also for free on Plex. While The Invitation is available on the same services, and also, for those with a subscription, it can be found on the Arrow Player. So, if your nerves can make it through both of those, I'll be back next Sunday, as usual, for the discussion. So until then, thanks again so much for listening, and have a really great week. Goodbye.